important part of these cooperative initiatives, the maritime defense and security capacity building, done largely in bilateral manner, but increasingly in minilateral and multilateral fashion, involving not just various, more endowed, much more powerful countries, but also international organizations such as the UNODC that is particularly active in maritime security capacity building, targeting various actors, coast guards, for example. And this is what is important as well, especially from the military point of view. When you have this cross-regional cooperation, it is meant to promote what many will call interoperability, not just between militaries, but amongst coast guards. Some will argue that the term interoperability may not necessarily be the right term to apply to coast guards, but what I'm trying to do here is to promote the idea that for certain common security problems that coast guards could be brought together to counter, we need some form of common rules, SOPs, and whatnot. And of course, this is something that is very big. It's easy to say that info sharing is important, and thereby is the most basic undertaking when it comes to this sort of cross-regional cooperation. But at the same time, we have to bear in mind the challenges when it comes to maritime domain awareness, information sharing. It's more than just about the tools like, say, AIS trackers or radar systems. It is very much also about the sharing of information within the country, meaning interagency within the country and between states and between the respective institutions itself. So all these are equally important, and I believe form a key part of the cross-regional cooperation in this part of the world, especially in the South China Sea. And just want to highlight here some of the interesting dynamics. I sort of lay out here the very first maritime cooperative activities that were done both bilaterally and multilaterally over the years. This is one example where I want to highlight that even though this is one very clear example of how concerned coastal states, together with extra-regional parties, could come together to assert freedom of navigation and overflight, as well as to backstop international law, it is important to note that there are definitely some form of escalatory dynamics in place. I put here some of those key events that happened, and one interesting thing was that some of those incidents actually led to an increase of interest by those extra-regional parties outside Southeast Asia when it comes to joining these activities. For example, after June 17, which was the last major clash at Second Thomas Shore, we saw from 4 parties outside Southeast Asia, it has increased to 3 parties. And of course, there's one thing to talk about how frequent they join these sort of exercises, but the sort of quantitative increase in the number of actors in these sort of activities seems to highlight a common concern about freedom of navigation, as well as other freedoms that supposedly user states are entitled to in the South China Sea. And the next question, what are those opportunities presented by extra-regional partners? I have here this one picture, which is a subject matter expert exchange between the Philippine and US armies, and that was on the very controversial system that was very much reported in the media, the Typhoon mid-range capability system, which is sort of an intermediate range offensive weapon system, which was very much well reported in not just the Philippine media, but as well in the Chinese media, regarding the escalatory dynamics that could pose certain risks to regional security. So I want to use this as an example to highlight some of those potential problems after that. But the prospects of extra-regional participation bring forth certain opportunities, right, other than risks. One of which being bring in niche assets that regional countries may not have in their forces. And they serve as what some will call capability multipliers. And it also served to promote the idea of collective deterrence, not in the same vein as, say, NATO alliance, but some form of a collective deterrence that is loosely formed around certain like-minded principles, right? And of course, the wider participation also brings forth higher signaling value. It's not just signaling to potential adversaries, but also when it comes to signaling reassurance to your friends in the region and even to your domestic audience as well. And of course, these may support and not necessarily supplant regional institutions like ASEAN. So this was one example exercise, Super Garuda Shield. It started off as a bilateral exercise between Indonesia and the US, which was called Garuda Shield, and then it sort of became a multilateral exercise some years ago, and became Super Garuda Shield. Some of these exercises were conducted in the South China Sea, for example, and they helped to assert the idea where states, they have the prerogative, the sovereign prerogative to train and exercise with other parties without coercion, and those are prerogatives that I believe many countries in Southeast Asia hold very dear to themselves. And at the same time, it helps to signal common concern about rules-based order or rule of law in the South China Sea. So what are those potential challenges and risks? So, of course, one is it may contribute to the widening of strategic trust deficit between rivals, which is something that I think many of us have talked about since the morning. The potential of miscalculation and escalation that I believe could come across from the very fact that in very limited and tight water spaces in certain instances, you have rival forces operating in close proximity and thereby raising potential risks of miscalculation and escalation if not handled properly. The entrapment in major power rivalries is something that I believe in ASEAN, it has been pretty much a concern amongst the smaller and weaker countries in the region. And of course, certain domestic and regional sensitivities as well. And of course, concern that having these cross-regional cooperative mechanisms might potentially undermine pre-existing regional processes like ASEAN processes, whether this was one question that was being raised earlier in the morning before lunch. And of course, the problem with legal ambiguities, we are operating in a maritime medium, and UNCLOS has its own inbuilt ambiguities, and thereby, if, say, these legal ambiguities were not being tackled properly, it could have an impact on the rule of law, or it could have this sort of opposite effect. Instead of promoting rule of law, it might actually undermine the rule of law itself. So when it comes to, say, handling risk, I think we go back to the very basic. If we disagree on strategic mechanisms, but I believe there are operational mechanisms that most of the maritime practitioners will agree with and are more willing to implement. For example, the case of the Code of Unplanned Encounters at Sea. This was one example where we see this thing coming into practice, where forces, they maintain a certain level of professionalism in their interaction. This was August last year, one of those MMCAs in the Philippine EEZ, or the West Philippine Sea, and you have here circled in red in the distance, a Chinese frigate is always there. I mean, most of the activities that take place usually will have Chinese forces keeping tabs at a certain distance. And so long as they are safe distance and they maintain certain protocols, those interactions are safe and I would say could be normalized going forward. Right. So me coming from RSIS, we cannot do without policy recommendation. It's like an occupational habit for myself. So I would just like to put forth a few things for you to think about and for us to discuss as well. One, which is one of the arguments that I keep making, is cross-regional defense cooperation has to go hand in hand with other parallel diplomatic, economic, and legal efforts. By that, what I mean is that if, say, for example, we want to promote rule of law in the South China Sea, just having cross-regional defense cooperation in itself will not be sufficient. It has to go in line with all other associated efforts, especially when it comes to, say, building economic resilience amongst the countries, as well as building more robust legal mechanisms. And of course, it should align with and promote pre-existing norms and SOPs, especially with regard to crisis stability mechanisms, such as queues that I mentioned earlier. And it has to be all-hands approach. It's not just military, which is where I come from right at the beginning, not just about defense establishment or militaries, but also with other civilian agencies, Coast Guards in particular. And in the recent years, we have been seeing the increasing nexus between militaries and Coast Guard agencies, not just in Southeast Asia, but elsewhere around the broader Indo-Pacific. And of course, the necessity to maintain some form of legal and strategic clarity in the conduct of these cross-regional defense mechanisms. So with that, thank you so much. I've laid the outline, and I'll leave my panelists to put the colors onto it. Thank you so much. Thank you, Vina.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Colin, for giving us a wonderful overview, both in terms of all the ways in which cross-regional defense cooperation can contribute to enhancing deterrence, to maritime domain awareness, sort of all the positive, also what might be some of the risks and challenges, which I hope we'll be unpacking a little bit more through the discussion, some of the recommendations for how best to align defense cooperation with other kinds of activities, where we certainly have seen that in the case of certain powers, it's defense forward, whereas maybe the economic programming has not been as active, and thus there might be some challenges there. And obviously, it would be also useful to unpack what would the future of cross-regional defense cooperation look like moving forward. I mean, we've seen, certainly in the last 5 years, a lot of mini-laterals emerging, sort of what that looks like. But there's lots for us to unpack, both in terms of opportunities, challenges, policy recommendations, and the way forward. But maybe let me invite each of our 4 discussants to kind of give quick reactions, add to what Colin said, maybe focusing on one or other elements, and then we'll open up to an actual Q&A, both from here, but also with the room. I have to say, hearing each other on this panel is a challenge, so let's try to speak as clearly as possible. You'll be amazed in the audience, but it's almost like it's the other side of the world when somebody's speaking out there. So, Sophie, why don't I turn to you next?
Sure. Thank you, Rina. Thank you, Dr. Ko, for the very comprehensive presentation. I have to confess that I run a background check on the panelists and the moderator. I did my homework before I came through AI, and this is what AI told me. You will be the only panelist representing Chinese perspective. And I look around the ballroom here. I think there are only 4 Chinese panelists present. And AI also warned me that everyone else ranges from moderately or extremely critical of China. And this is not really a balanced panel. It's 4 against 1. So I'm quite alone, and I'm trying to hold my grounds here. But I have to put this out first. I can't speak for the government. I am a scholar who is trying to help the others to interpret what Chinese strategic intention is. When I don't speak in the official lines, I think it might be more helpful for you to understand what I'm trying to say. So I'm going to put the core message out there. I think Dr. Ko point out a very important point here, which is there needs to be mechanisms to prevent crisis or manage them before we see increasing military presence in the blue waters. And my argument is that if current policies persist, collisions and crises will become the norm, not exceptions. And we need to shift from debating who was right in the past, which was what we did in the morning, or to preventing accidents in the future, actually saving lives from preventable accidents or incidents in sea. Existing crisis management mechanisms between China and other militaries demonstrated what works, and we should replicate success, not repeat failures or trying to find out who was right or wrong in the past. We should be focusing on the future. And I just want to share a few facts here. So China, as Dr. Ko mentioned, had huge protocols with the US. China and India also had border management. And if you are familiar with what happened between China and India, it was fistfights between the 2 militaries during the borderline. And what happens in the news today is the 2 sides of militaries exchange candies, sweets. So that is what is the new facts for you. there are mechanisms that works if we agree to sit down on the negotiation table and really talk about what could work. And I think the puzzle here is FONOPS. We talk about FONOPS and how Chinese military will intercept the other side's military, either naval vessels or fighter jets. But we never talk about where are those fighter jets and where are those naval vessels. They're inside China's territorial waters or airspace. And I think we have reached a consensus that there are disputed territories, right? So why do those kind of FONOPS in the disputed territories that you know it would definitely be read by Beijing as an incursion or invasion of territorial space? Of course, the Chinese Air Force and the Navy would be in operation to intercept, because Chinese also need to defend its core national interests and sovereignty. And also we understand that there are disputes over territorial sovereignty that could not be solved. And that's why I think for at least the last 2 decades, our former leader, Deng Xiaoping, proposed joint development and shelving the disputes, and it worked. And also it worked between China and Vietnam. We have reached agreements on several different things on how to manage the disputes over territorial waters, but why can't we do it with Philippines? And I think this is what we need to do, is to focus on how we can save lives from preventable crises or incidents, rather than focus on the past, which are already the facts for today and the context there we are operating right now and today. And China, as the second largest navy in the world, China also enjoys freedoms of navigation. But I don't think China would do as the US or its Western allies do, to sail in disputed territory waters that is outside China's claims. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Yi. We certainly will have a robust discussion on the panel, which is great. And as you mentioned, you may be the only voice presenting China's perspective, but you certainly do it very eloquently. And for those who haven't seen your most recent paper published by the Lowy Institute, which speaks specifically to this issue, I think it's nicely titled, "Someone's Freedom of Navigation is Another's Territorial Intrusion," which essentially summarizes the argument that you're making, that from a perspective of China, because it has this really expensive territorial claim, including in South China Sea, obviously it sees this not as freedom of navigation exercises, but intrusion. But of course, from our perspective, it becomes a rather circular argument, because if one doesn't accept China's expensive territorial claims, then that argument doesn't work. So in any event, you've done your homework, we have as well, so it'll be a really interesting discussion. But let me continue and invite Freddie to weigh in next.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Madam Chair, for the introduction. And before I start, I just would like to say thank you to the We Protect Our Seas organization for the invitation to participate in this dialogue as one of your panelists. This is just the second iteration of this Manila dialogue. And so therefore, I wish you more success in the future, that you can conduct more dialogues like this one. We need more dialogue so we can talk about the issues that we have in the South China Sea. And before I start, I need to make a disclaimer because I'm a government officer, I'm a senior state counsel, but I'll be speaking more as a subject matter expert. So unless I specify that what I'm saying is the position of the government of the Republic of the Philippines, I am speaking based on my personal views as a subject matter expert. So I took note of the title of the panel, which is Securing Freedom of Navigation and Rule of Law Through Cross-Regional Defense Cooperation. So I'm just going to give general comments on this one. First, the principle, this concept of freedom of navigation, it's one of the oldest principle in international law. It goes all the way back to the 15th century when scholars back then and jurists grapple with the issue of whether vast areas of the waters of the oceans can be placed under the sovereignty or jurisdiction of a state. So it goes all the way back, and this is in the context of the seafaring trade of the European nations. And in 1609, Hugo Grotius wrote this book, Mare Liberum, or the Free Seas, which explains that no state can own the high seas, but all states can enjoy the high seas, and this principle of the freedom of the high seas, of course, include freedom of navigation, the most popular freedom under the principle of the freedom of the high seas. And as international law developed, it also includes freedom of overflight, freedom of laying submarine cables and pipelines, freedom of fishing, freedom of laying submarine cables and pipelines, and the freedom to take measures to protect and preserve the marine environments. It's a very old principle. It's considered as customary international law. It was codified in the 1959 Convention on the High Seas, and then again codified and made part of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which is considered as the Constitution of the Oceans. Now, of course, this freedom of navigation, the most popular freedom under the concept of the freedom of the high seas, can be considered as an important pillar for the maintenance of the rule of law in the South China Sea. Why is it that we need to discuss this freedom of navigation in the South China Sea? And it's because there is an issue there of navigation because of China's 9-line, right? So there is this issue on China's 9-line that encloses almost the entire South China Sea. And there's an arbitral award that was issued last July 12, 2016 that says that this 9-line has no basis in international law and that there are no overlapping exclusive economic zones between China and the Philippines within 200 nautical miles from the archipelagic baselines of the Philippines. And why is this award important on freedom of navigation? Because if that area is the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines, it means that the freedom of navigation applies in that area. Also, if we imagine this South China Sea and it is surrounded by several coastal states, and if each of these coastal states generate their maritime zones from their baselines strictly in accordance with the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, then there would be in the middle of the South China Sea the high seas. And in the high seas, the freedom of navigation applies. So the full freedom of navigation, freedom of the high seas would apply in the middle of the South China Sea. We call that there's a donut hole in the South China Sea where the freedom of the high seas apply. And in addition, because waters of the exclusive economic zone are considered as international waters, then the freedom of navigation would also apply in the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines and of all of these coastal states surrounding the South China Sea. Now, with respect to the rule of law, how would you uphold the rule of law in the South China Sea? Since you know that there are the high seas there and the exclusive economic zones there, then you exercise your freedom of navigation in the waters of the South China Sea. Because if not, we'll be back to the issue in the 15th century of whether of mare clausum and mare liberum, of whether these seas are open to all, or these seas can be placed, this vast area of the sea can be placed under the jurisdiction or sovereignty of one state. So that's a very important issue that has been resolved already a long time ago, and we are afraid that we're seeing it again in the South China Sea. Now, with respect to cross-regional defense cooperation, I listened to the presentation, of course, of Colin, and On the part of the Philippines, it has entered into several visiting forces agreements. The oldest one, of course, is with the United States, and then there is also another with Australia, and then now we have one with New Zealand, Japan, and just recently with Canada. We also have several maritime memorandum of understanding on defense cooperation, including with Singapore, etc. And the advantage, I think, of these various agreements is it helps in providing deterrence on the part of the Philippines in the West Philippine Sea, in the South China Sea. The West Philippine Sea just refers to the waters within 200 nautical miles of the Philippine archipelagic baseline. So it contributes to developing the deterrence of the Philippines, and of course, overlapping partnerships ensures resilience, because the Philippines is still in the stage of developing its credible deterrence. It's still in the stage of modernizing its armed forces, its navy, etc. So in the meantime, all of these agreements would help the Philippines in ensuring that the rule of law is upheld in the West Philippine Sea. And just to say that the reason why we need all of these treaties for the Philippines is because our Constitution requires us to enter into these treaties. For foreign troops, they cannot really enter Philippine territory without a treaty as provided in our Constitution. So I think that's all for now, and if you have questions, I will answer them during the Q&A. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Freddie. And thank you for giving us the legal understandings of freedom of navigation concepts and how it applies to South China Sea, and also then speaking specifically to why Philippines engages in the kinds of cross-regional defense cooperations, the various MOUs you have in place, as well as visiting forces agreements and so forth. So if we actually look at kind of the map of South China Sea, Philippines does sit at the center of a number of minilaterals and a number of arrangements. So there's quite a bit there that I think, obviously, the government of Philippines believes contributes to its resilience and its capacity to contribute to deterrence. So moving down the line, Ray, if I can invite you for your initial comments.
Great, thanks so much. So I'm going to go ahead and frame this in response to Sophie's presentation here. And I want to start with a question of why are we seeing more collisions, more crises in the South China Sea than we have in the past? What is the major change that has happened that has caused this? And I think that the answer is actually not freedom of navigation operations, because those have been happening all over the world for over 4 decades. Freedom of navigation operations are not a new invention. What is different is the environment in which they happen, right? So a freedom of navigation operation in US Navy parlance is simply an assertion of rights under UNCLOS, right? It's freedom of navigation through a particular claim that in the US Navy estimation, or the US estimation, is unlawful. And so they're going to go ahead and challenge that claim. The United States does it against their friends. They do it against their allies. Anyone who has in what the United States believes to be an excessive claim under UNCLOS could be subject to a freedom of navigation operation. What is different is the simple amount of paramilitary capability in the South China Sea brought by one country, the People's Republic of China, and that country's willingness to use that in an aggressive way to try to assert its changes to the previous status quo. And this is what I mean by that. I started studying the South China Sea in the 1980s. Back in the 1980s, nobody tried to control the water. There was essentially disputes over features, a reef, a shoal, a rock, an island, right? So we saw a couple of bloody confrontations, say in 1974, in the Paracel Islands, in 1988, at Johnson South Reef. But all of those were centered in on individual features. That's because nobody had the capacity, the capability to try to control water. What we are seeing today is an attempt to control water. And the way I tend to frame this is that this is actually the most successful expansionist project in the past 50 years. People are familiar with Russia's territorial expansion in Eastern Europe, and that has, depending on how you think of it, it can't simply be considered an unqualified success by any means. But China's expansionist project, which has taken place in the maritime space, in the gray zone, through the application of paramilitary maritime force, has actually been remarkably successful. And the way I think of this, let's take, for example, what happened August 11th. We saw a collision between a PLA Navy ship and a China Coast Guard ship. But we don't often talk about why that happened. The ship that was in the closest proximity, in fact, extremely close to the bow of both ships, was a 44-meter Philippine Coast Guard ship, which was being pursued by both ships and came dangerously close to being rammed, right? So we had a 7,500-ton guided missile destroyer pursuing a 350-ton Coast Guard ship, along with a large China Coast Guard ship. Why was that happening? Why was there a gray hull, a Navy destroyer, involved in this at all? It's because that Philippine Coast Guard ship was in a place that until about 18 months ago, Philippine Coast Guard ships went all the time. That is, near Scarborough Shoal, maybe about 10 nautical miles away. The reason there was a Navy destroyer all of a sudden getting involved, which had previously not really been experienced, was because this was sort of the laying down of the law for this new regime that was going to say, you can't come here anymore. It was a change in the status quo that we have been tracking at Sea Light about a 30 nautical mile exclusion zone being enforced around Scarborough Shoal since about May of 2024. This one ship, this one Philippine Coast Guard ship, was inside that exclusion zone, and that was what drew out the destroyer. So we are seeing an aggressive change to the status quo around Scarborough Shoal. We have seen an aggressive change to the status quo at Sabina Shoal. We are seeing a maritime expansion, and we're seeing it happen in the gray zone. So now let's talk about cross-regional cooperation. How long are we going to experience maritime expansion in the South China Sea or in East Asia generally? Until, in the estimation of the People's Republic of China, the costs of expansion outweigh the benefits. Clearly, they are not there at this point. The Philippines has tried two innovations to try to, to nibble away at this cost-benefit calculation. One, of course, was the arbitral case that they brought in 2013 and which they won in 2016. And of course, the second has been this transparency project. Having one country do these things, in Beijing's estimation, clearly has not been enough to cause it to say that the costs outweigh the benefits. This is where cross-regional cooperation is not just timely, it is overdue. At some point, there needs to be enough cooperation so that Beijing concludes that this expansionist project needs to end. And I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. I think if anybody was not awake, we're all awake now. I think there's a really interesting question in that, though, what kind of costs can we impose and who will be participating in that and how to change that cost-benefit analysis. And I know Sophie probably wants to respond to that as well. But before we get to the broader discussion, John, your initial comments.
Thank you, and thank you very much to the organizers. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, and thank you very much to... No?
They can't hear.
I'll use that. Oh. Now, thank you very much to the organizers, WPS Foundation, Jeffrey especially, for inviting me all the way from London, and to the panel and to Colin for his great presentation. I'll channel a little bit of a UK perspective here. I'm sort of flagging with my jet lag and thinking how far away London is from the South China Sea. Why do we care? Why did the UK send the HMS Albion to do a freedom of navigation maneuver in 2018? Why did the 2014 maritime strategy by the Royal Navy mention explicitly for the first time the South China Sea, a feature very, very far from British shores? And the reason is that the UK has long been a maritime power, long relied on the freedom of navigation for its lifeblood, for its economic lifeblood. I mean, this is a very clear part of it. So when I see, Colin's wonderful presentation, I'm aware that something is broken down to bring states to this level. From the perspective of an international relations scholar who really admires UNCLOS, I really admire ITLOS, I admire the aspirational side to that. I'm very much sort of jaded international liberal. The fact that we are having to do collective military messaging is a sign that things are going the wrong way. The fact that the UK, the French, the Germans, the Canadians, Japanese, Australians, so many states, India, many states that have, they all have imperial legacies. They'd rather not be here. They don't want to be here, but they're being drawn in by this long term. And Dr. Yi, I feel bad that you are in some ways the only voice on here of China, but I also think about, the Philippine fishermen and Royal Marine, Philippine Marines that are also sort of surrounded by so many Chinese actors in this situation. There is a coercive effect that's not very helpful when international arbitration or international law would provide those easy levers. So I generally agree with all the various points that Colin put down. I predict the UK will continue to enhance the relationship with the Philippines. The carrier strike group came through. We did have one vessel come through to the Philippines, which was great. We also had Operation High Mast with the United States and Japan. So although the tilt is over, the UK Indo-Pacific remains important. Yes, NATO first, but not NATO only. The United Kingdom remains, I think, emboldened and invigorated by the idea that these two theaters, what happens in the Indo-Pacific relates to the Euro-Atlantic and vice versa. And so I'm very sure, it's not the UK government perspective, but I'm very sure that you will see Royal Navy ships increasingly added to the number of multilateral cooperative engagements that we see that are signaling in the South China Sea. What can China do about it? I mean, of course, you can continue to message that the British are imperial and returning out of a lack of, ability to do anything, or they lack relevance, as Global Times continued to say when the Prince of Wales. But on the other hand, you could just, return to arbitration or return to UNCLOS and to the fundamental principles of the rule of law. So in a sense, although I would prefer the legal mechanisms, I can see that when states make an effort to diplomatically stop a sort of takeover of a maritime region of international importance, if the state that's doing that just refuses to ever compromise, ultimately states will do what they do, which is they will make collective defense arrangements. Now, that might not be an alliance, but certainly they will try to do that softly, and they will try to match the level of escalation of the state that is doing the territorial capture. So it's very sad that we're here, but I hope that we can reverse direction ultimately one day. And with that, I'll turn it over to the moderator. Thanks for letting me share.
Great. Thank you very much, John. You're absolutely right. UK has a stake, so does Canada, and I guess as a Canadian on the panel, I should note that we also care for all the reasons that we heard this morning. But I think the point also that's being raised, and it came really clearly from what Ray said, all of our presence here in the signaling is not enough in terms of deterring China from becoming more aggressive. And then with China becoming more aggressive, with us coming in with more force, the risk of miscalculation, the risk of accident goes up, which I think is the point that Sophie was mentioning as well. So there is agreement on that sense that we're all worried about the sort of the risks of escalation, the risks of accidents, and how do we crisis manage at the same time as collectively also deterring the actions in China essentially pushing the boundaries. So maybe, and I will come in a minute to the room to bring you into this conversation, but maybe I could invite Sophie just to respond a little bit to what you heard from the other fellow panelists, and then come back to you, Ray, and then Colin, if you want to weigh in on anything that you've heard based on your presentation, and then I'll come out to the room. So, Sophie, the floor is yours.
Yeah, sure, thank you. I would say AI is 100% correct about what I'm going to encounter at the panel. I'm also trained in the UK as a scholar, so I received the trainings as how the Western world understands differences in perceptions and international relations. But I would just want to quickly say that I also care a lot about Filipino fishermen. So does I care about Chinese fishermen. I also care about what is happening right now in Philippines, the natural disasters, the typhoons. Philippines declare a state of emergency because of the typhoon. I mean, China can work with the Philippines to provide more technical supports regarding disaster relief. If you ask any Chinese citizen, they will tell you that the military, they actually work on natural disaster relief inside China. And that is why they are called the most adorable person in China. And secondly, I want to respond to the gray zone concepts. I'm not very fond of the word of gray zone. This is a concept that, it's not an objective concept. This concept has provided some kind of negative perception over what someone could describe as military operations other than war. I think that is more of the term that I would use rather than gray zone operations. Because if a country, say China, employs military operations other than war, they're sending coast guards, not navies, there is an incentive that we don't want escalation in military confrontations. That's why the coast guards are there. And going back to the August 11th clash, I think you've mentioned the tonnage of different vessels, but at that point, as I mentioned before, China sees it as an incursion. I don't think we can reach an agreement on whatever that means or definition, so I don't want to continue that debate, but I wanted to remind you that it was a very smaller ship, as you mentioned, comparing to Chinese naval ship and the Coast Guard ship. So it was traveling at a very high speed. So collisions like that happens, of course. If that's what happens when both vessels belong to the same country, imagine what happens in three-way encounters between Chinese, Philippines, and US vessels in the same ways, in the same waters. I do need to remind you that China and US and Philippines shares the mutual defense agreement. I think China and the Philippines are both concerned, and so does the US, about what will happen and what could trigger that mutual defense agreement. And if you pay more attention to President Trump's speech recently, he didn't quite mention South China Sea. He's focused a lot more on doing a good trade deal with China. I don't think South China Sea is top on his list. And I think that is what the Philippine government should think about as well. And I want to also mention that Ray mentioned the 1974 and 1988 incidents. I want to bring out the border picture. What happens back then, there was a very different structural framework globally. But then it was a Cold War. With Vietnam, there were two Vietnams, two different governments. And during the 1988, there was the Cold War where the Soviet Unions and the Americans are competing for influence in the region. And China had obviously concerns about how things will unfold. And in 1988, the incidents, there were very clear instructions from the top of the command that the Chinese should not fire the first shots. I know this might subject to disagreement and arguments about who really fired the first shot, but I think for the Chinese side, Chinese had no intention to escalate any kinds of military confrontation into a full-scale war. That has been very consistent since the 1970s, and later on 1990s, we share our good views as we continue our economic reform. China focused a lot on its economic development, and I think that is also what the Philippines and other ASEAN countries should think about. The former leader of Singapore, Lee Hsien Loong, he actually said this at Chatham House in London, I think 2 weeks back. He said most of the Asian countries don't see China as a security threat. Then why should the Philippines see China as a security threat? We can work on a lot of stuff. The militaries can work on how we can provide better support to disaster relief, like supporting things like the typhoon currently happening in Philippines. Because the Hainan Island in China also suffers from typhoon and other natural disaster relief. We have experiences to share. We don't need to focus on the things that we cannot agree with each other all the time. And
maybe just briefly, Sophie.
yeah, just very my last point. I think Ray kind of made a calculation. Did the calculations there. I want to make a calculation for the Filipino from the Filipino side as well. I think the question to the Filipino government is that, I understand both governments face domestic pressures to appear strong. This goes to the Philippines and China and other countries as well. But neither leader can appear to consider sovereignty for domestic political reasons. And the question to the Filipino government, what's stronger? Letting Filipino sailors die in preventable accidents to avoid appearing weak on sovereignty, or having mechanisms that protect Filipino lives while maintaining sovereignty claims? The frameworks that China and Vietnam and India reached were not perfect. But I think that both sides understand that even though we cannot agree on the sovereignty disputed claims, but we can agree on how we manage those tensions and claims. So I think crisis management mechanisms don't require a certain set of principles. India-China border mechanisms don't mean India accepts Chinese territorial claims, nor the Vietnam-China channel mean Vietnam accepts Chinese sovereignty. They mean both sides value human life over political theater. And I think that is the most important thing that the Filipino government should think about. To publicize the incidents, and that has driven Chinese government to release the videos of the collisions as well, which Chinese government did not do that in the past. So right now, both governments prioritize appearing strong over being safe. And that's the path to accidental war. And I think this is a very clear warning for where we are heading in the future. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Sophie. I know there are a number of colleagues from Philippines who are ready to respond. I see all sorts of hands have gone up. So maybe in the interest of time, given that it's 4:22, I will not come back to you right away. I will just open the floor and try to see what we can do here. Why don't I start here in the middle just to get a reply from Jay and then from Jeff. Yes, so go ahead. This might be a very hard moderating job because I see many hands. Go ahead.
Yes. I have 3 questions to Dr. Yi. First of all, I would like to ask, you were mentioning that you never militarized the South China Sea. But in 2015, when President Xi Jinping came to visit President Barack Obama, you promised that the reclaimed islands that you were building then will not be militarized. But right now, we know for a fact that jet fighters can already land in those 7 reclaimed areas of the People's Republic of China. My second question is, if you do not agree calling your actions in the South China Sea as part of the gray zone tactics, because in the Philippines we call it illegal, coercive, aggressive, and deceptive, how would you call it? My third question, in case you run out of time, I want you to prioritize this third last question of mine. 2 years ago, I attended Shangri-La Dialogue. I asked your defense minister why there is a disconnect between China's words and China's actions when it comes to the South China Sea. Thank you.
Great. So, Sophie, just if you could list all of them, we'll come to Jeff and then, yeah.
Yeah, just a quick comment to the question raised by Dr. Yi, actually. She asked, why can Vietnam and China do joint development, but not China and the Philippines? I think that's apples and oranges, actually, because that agreement happened in the Gulf of Tonkin. There is a legitimate overlap between Chinese and Vietnamese EEZ. There is no legitimate overlap between Philippine and Chinese EEZ. And in fact, there are no other successful case of joint development in the South China Sea. Indonesia and China has no successful joint development. Malaysia and China has no successful joint development. Why? Because of the 9-dash line. That's the only reason there. There is no overlap, legitimate overlap. And so it seems to me that China is interested to do joint development in others' EEZ. The question is China willing to do joint development in its own EEZ, say Philippine-China joint development within 200 nautical miles of mainland China? Because if that's the case, then that's truly making China a sincere actor in terms of pursuing joint development. Thank you.
Thank you. It's what is mine, what is yours is shared kind of concept. Yes. Okay, so I see, Yamanoto, yes, you're being very active there.
Okay. Thank you so much. I have a question for all the speakers. So you discussed now about the Chinese action, but all participants forgot another entity. So for example, Japan and the Philippines, we are facing the border with Taiwan. So Taiwan armed forces activity in our region is very serious activity for our neighbors. So I think if secure the freedom of navigation in our areas, I think these kind of Navy, Air Force, or Coast Guard, law enforcement communication framework, we gathered to the Taiwan armed forces. Do you have any comment of my suggestion? Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Okay, so the lady right next to you, Aziwa, yeah.
Thank you very much. So my question is to Dr. Colin Cole, desirable end state of the South China Sea especially. I'm Riho Aizawa from I'm a research fellow from NIS, National Institute for Defense Studies, under the JMOD, Japanese for Ministry of Defense. And as a practitioner, I supported to create the Defense Cooperation Initiative toward ASEAN and Pacific Islanders. So all kinds of efforts should be done at the same time. Dr. Colin Cole said so, and I totally agree with that. But as other participants showed that, to point out that the current situation in the South China Sea is already unfavorable. Unilateral changes to the status quo already happened, land reclamation, militarization, continuing coercive actions. And I was kind of surprised to see the negative list of defense cooperation on your presentation, like miscalculation, entrapment, something like that. So should we believe in good spirit of the challenger? Are we still living in a different world? I was very confused. So could you, especially to Dr. Colin Cole, and of course, welcome from other participants. Could you clarify desirable end state of the South China Sea from your perspective, and how they are different from other partners' end state, you think? Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much. So I'll move around the room. I'll go to the middle section there, and I see William Yang. I'll give you the floor, and then I'll go around and come back.
Thank you so much. William Young from International Crisis Group. I think my question is that from all the presenters, it does seem like there is a fundamental mismatch to begin with when it comes to the perceptions and also the preferred approach to try to, address these fundamental differences and arguments. If we were to be very practical and really want to start mitigating the risks of escalation, where would, I guess, each of, or some, any of the presenters actually think that we can, realistically to begin with? Because if we can't even find that starting point for all sides to actually get together, see eye to eye, and start a realistic and very, non-heated conversation, we need to actually be able to identify the entry point. But right now, it does seem like different sides, all sides, have very different perceptions, and it's hard to really back down from that position. Thank you.
Excellent. That's an excellent point, and I do hope that everybody on the panel can reflect on that. I see Graham over here.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
No, we cannot. Is there a mic floating around?
Can you hear me on this? Try again.
I like the problem solving though there with your neighbor, but it doesn't seem to be working.
How about now?
There we go. That was behind you. Cross-regional cooperation.
All right, I think third time lucky. Question on defence cooperation for all the panel. There are a couple of developments out of the ADMM Plus last week that were noteworthy. The US Secretary of War announced that he'd met his so-called squad counterparts. What are the implications for the freedom of navigation of increased defence cooperation between US, Japan, Australia, and the Philippines? Secondly, he also announced the standing up of a task force within the US-Philippines alliance. That strikes me potentially significant development. Would that, Ray, to take your point, whether Philippines has had two-step change approaches so far, could that be a third that could potentially give the Philippines the confidence to start freedom of navigation using grey hulls to disputed features, which up until now it's been somewhat reluctant to do? Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So the squad and task force, I'll come over here to the gentleman here, Bradford. Yeah.
No, it's on? Okay, actually, if it's okay, I'm going to answer two of the questions that Dr. Yi asked.
Even better.
She asked a couple questions about can we imagine? And I spent 15 years on ships operating in the East and South China Sea. And so I have very good answers to those questions. I don't really have to imagine. I have experience. The first one was, can we imagine the Chinese Navy sailing far away over the seas and entering US disputed waters? First of all, yeah, I could imagine that. The one place where the United States has disputed waters is north of Alaska along the Canadian border. And yes, someday I could see the Chinese Navy looking for an Arctic Passage, the Northwest Passage, and sailing through there. But what I don't have to imagine is that already we have many incidents, I know you ask us not to think of the past, of the Chinese Navy entering non-disputed US waters, entering the territorial seas off of Alaska. And as all 15 of those years I was based in Japan, I'm also very sensitive to the many times when the Chinese Navy has entered undisputed Japanese waters. I'm not talking about around the Senkakus, I'm talking around Kyushu. So I don't have to imagine. And then the second, again, to think back to my days at sea, you said if three ships are operating, or ships from three different countries are operating at high speeds near each other, can I imagine how dangerous that is? Yes, I can. And I can tell you that if there's a collision, it's because one of those ship captains or one of those bridge crews is either being deliberately dangerous or negligent. And I see, when I watch these videos, it's always one of those two things. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. I'll come to Mr. Hu here in the middle.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. If I may, I can just pick up the question from Jay. Okay, I think you and the U.S. has misunderstood China's signal about the non-militarization. In Chinese, militarization is a process and a degree. It is not a certain result. So, and also I don't agree with that. In the last 20 decades or 3 decades, China is always expanding in the South China Sea. I think China's claims is always consistent, and China's policy in the South China Sea always consistent. That's sharing the disputes. Compared with 20 years before, I think the only changes are China's capability and determination to safeguard its maritime its sovereignty and maritime rights. So, the Philippines colleagues invite me to here. I want to have some contributions to your country. I think China's position in the South China Sea is always in the response position. Most of the time, we just respond for the challenges from the Philippines, from Vietnam. I think, for instance, in the Scarborough Shoal, China has claimed the Scarborough Shoal for a long time, but it is the Philippines' aggressive actions push China to control the Scarborough Shoal and increase the military presence around the Scarborough Shoal. So my suggestion frankly speaking, suggestion to Philippines is that don't give China chances anymore. And I also want to mention about I think there are 2 kinds of rumors, I think, spread abroad. One rumor is that China claims the South China Sea inside ~9 as its sovereignty. That's totally rumors and fake news. I think President Wu has made it very clearly that this morning, we just claimed the 4 island groups as sovereignty. And also, there are another rumors that China restricts the foreign military activities in the South China Sea. That's nonsense. Actually, the foreign military forces, I think, have the freedom of navigation only as long as they are not intention to enter China's territory, say, and airspace of mainland China and the Paris Islands and the Scarborough Shoal, and also the 12 nautical miles of China-occupied features in the Spirit Islands. So in the most part of the South China Sea, even military freedom navigation are no problem. There's no problem. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much. I know the panel would want to respond to that, including to the so-called fake news. Mr. Faraya?
Can you hear me? Oh, yes. Thank you very much. I'm Furuya, professor at Griffith and Keio University in Japan. My question is the contribution of the Coast Guard agencies in the region for the freedom of navigation or to improve this stability in South China Sea and even Eastern Sea. Corinco and Powell, Ray Powell briefly mentioned about the Coast Guard interoperability or the exercises. How do you think, do we need to increase the number of exercises, or what would be the influences of those exercises or the activities to deter aggressive activities in South China Sea? Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. I know we have a lot of questions, and I have been told we have a hard stop, so I'm going to try to collect maybe 3 more and then come back oh my goodness, I feel really bad. The lady in the back, Isaac, I think, if I'm reading your name correctly. Yes, please, the floor is yours.
Hello.
Now we can get you functioning mic.
Hello. Okay. Hi, good afternoon. My name is Bryn Isaac. I'm from the Philippine International Law of the Sea Academy. My question is, how can cross-regional defense cooperation be designed and framed to clearly demonstrate a commitment to upholding international law rather than being perceived by claimant states as a geopolitical move to contain a specific power?
Great, fantastic question. All right, I'll come back to yes, I see you. I don't see your name though. Yeah. Gentleman in the navy suit, yes.
My question is for Dr. Colin Koh. Since 2024, China has informed ASEAN officials in a few bilateral meetings that the time of hedging is coming to an end. A particular ASEAN country was asked if it has a Taiwan contingency plan. So my question is this: from a Southeast Asian perspective, how will ASEAN states respond if they are under pressure to end hedging? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I see one in the very back there. Yes, gentlemen.
Hello. Okay, good afternoon. I'm Joshua Espeña from the Polytechnic University of the Philippines. My question is addressed to Dr. Sophie Yi. So you often emphasize the idea of shelving disputes to allow cooperation to move forward. But given the evident asymmetry between China and the Philippines in both capability and strategic intent, may I ask from your perspective, what factors make it difficult for China to also consider moderating or shelving some of its, more expansive maritime claims, especially since the Philippines, as you frame, poses no threat to China's security. Doing so might in fact enhance mutual trust and demonstrate its regional leadership in promoting stability. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I think maybe, okay, just one more in the very back there, gentleman in the light blue suit, and then we'll draw the line there. Do you need a mic?
Thank you for giving me the last question. So my question is for Sophie. And actually, if we analyze the data that have been produced by CSIS China Powers, they listed 73 major incidents in the South China Sea between 2010 and 2020. Myself, through a collaboration with them, I was able to re-evaluate to 125 incidents from 2000 to 2025 with a near doubling of the regularity of incidents at sea from 2020 to 2025 compared to the 10 years prior. So we clearly have an augmentation of the number of incidents, a number also in terms of regularity, intensity, and diversity of the phenomena that I call asymmetric warfare, which in my words means a combination of area denial, hybrid warfare, and gray zone tactics. What would you say could be the outcome in the short term if we keep having such a growing number of occurrences and diversity and intensity of such phenomena and interactions between the countries operating in the area? And second small question is, I noticed that prior to 2019, Vietnam was subjected to 50% of the interactions between China and Southeast Asian countries. The Philippines were 25%. But after 2019, it was the reverse. The Philippines were the recipient of 60 or plus % of these interactions, and Vietnam came down to 20%. So what do you think it means about the interactions between Vietnam and China and Philippines and China?
Great. Thank you so much. Well, colleagues, I think we have so many questions and such a diverse set of comments. Obviously, we can't answer all of them, but maybe if we could try to at least address some of the big ones. Dr. Yi, there were a number of questions to you, so maybe I'll start with you first. Go ahead.
Yes. Sorry, I have to do most of the talking. But I'm happy that at least Chinese voices are out and you're actually interested in listening to a Chinese. Who is not the government, though. I think on the question or the comment Jeffrey gave or the commander gave there on, I think Dr. Hu, Professor Hu actually answered a lot of it. But just on gray zone, I've already gave my answer. Is military operations other than war. That is not signals a negative conceptualization of that nature of the operations, but rather tells you very objectively the intention of the military operations is not for war, but to manage the tensions. And also for militarization, this word came out quite a lot. But really, how to define militarization? Do you have a very clear indicator of how we measure one's militarization? I mean, the words like securitization, militarization, they come out a lot in the academia. But really, what does those words mean? I don't think a lot of us really read the academic journal articles. I mean, I have to do it because I have to do it for my PhD. So I think I had a pretty good understanding of the conceptions are up for interpretation. And I don't want to get into the arguments that we could not reach an agreement on. But I think I want to also briefly touch on what we can do to manage the situation. I have mentioned that there are things we cannot resolve and should stop wasting time on. For example, who has valid historical rights on features, and whether the 2016 tribunal and whether FONOP's near disputed features are legitimate, and other things that the list goes on. These debates have consumed years with zero progress, and I think a lot of you that has been through a lot of the South China Sea conferences will share this sentiment, right? We reach nowhere by talking about the old topics day in and day out. What's the point? And meanwhile, we are really seeing the collision risk increase. So here's my suggestion on the things we can resolve with political will. Firstly, communication protocols between Coast Guards during encounters, procedures for emergency situations, medical evacuation, rescue operations, advance notification for certain types of operations, agreed definitions of dangerous maneuvers, regular commander meetings to build trust. Strategic checks is lacking. I don't think it exists between China and the US or China and the Philippines. And that is something that we could work towards by attending and speaking and exchanging ideas at forums like this. Hotlines that function during crisis, protocols for fishing vessel safety. None of this require resolving sovereignty, but all of this reduce accidental risks. And I think I just make a very final point on the loads of questions. I think there is, what we are seeing right now in China, we call it changes unseen in a century. We are seeing the end of the unipolar moment of the US. We are seeing the US naval vessels crashing into South China Sea and also the Black Hawk helicopters incidents in Washington last year. If you really do the calculations of how many incidents that the US military actually caused, rather than just fixated on Chinese military, you will be surprised. The Nimitz aircraft carrier is almost 50 years old. Where would this be headed? Would the US be capable or having the political will to continue the alliance maintenance in the Indo-Pacific or in the South China Sea? I think without, giving more information about Trump, I mean, we all know Trump's ideas focus more on trade rather than the South China Sea. So I think ASEAN centrality is really what we need to work towards too. Philippines will be the chair of ASEAN next year. And I've heard words from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs from Philippines saying that there is a willingness to consolidate the code of conduct in 2026. And I want to urge everyone here that we need the efforts to make sure the code of conduct can be consolidated and not consolidated just as a waste of paper, but actually the crisis management that could work and manage tensions. And we could not do that if the Philippines continue to think that China will compromise on sovereignty issues. And I think that is the starting point for either bilateral negotiations or multilateral cooperations between China and ASEAN, and the Code of Conduct will be the best example of that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Ko? Colin, I'll come to you next. There were a few questions that were specifically directed to you, but also maybe some of the general questions, including practical entry points, given some of the difficulties of agreeing on the basics here. Go ahead.
Sure, thank you. There are a host of questions, so I hope I could cover as much as possible. So if not, then don't worry, at the end of the session, you can hijack me to one side. I will try to explain as much as I can. To Yamamoto-san's question, you mentioned Taiwan. To me, it sometimes comes across as sensitive, but I think it goes back to the 1990s. If you recall, the South China Sea Workshop series, that was, to me, very interesting because it actually involved Taiwan in the entire process, including, for example, the conduct of marine scientific expeditions to the area. And I thought that would have been a great model of trying to promote some form of more inclusive CSBMs that includes Taiwan itself. But I think we have sort of passed that at this current stage where, even the involvement of Taiwan in the whole process in the South China Sea becomes sensitive to even some of the other concerned parties. So what I tend to see is most likely bilateral, low-key, low-profile type of CSBMs that could take place. So it will be a collection of these bilateral initiatives rather than realistically expecting Taiwan to be included, say, for example, in the COC, even though I believe that could be Taipei's interest to be involved in it as well. So this is a brief response to your question. To Aizawa-san's question, and you were asking what's the desirable end state. Without overstating the obvious, the desirable end state is where you have all parties involved adhere to rule of law, right? But that is easier said than done when you have differing parties that essentially have different interpretations of the rule of law. It isn't just to do with boundary issues, but it also involves discussions about foreign military activities in their respective EEZ. There are a host of these issues that I believe that require resolution before we even reach that desired end state. Until then, I believe managing what we have right now and ensuring that we don't go beyond the Rubicon, crossing the Rubicon into an armed conflict is very likely what I tend to see as a very simplistic goal right now by everyone. It's simple to say, but not exactly easy to accomplish. We run into difficulty even trying to get, for example, and this is to pack on to your question, in the Code of Conduct negotiation, much of the initiatives were on practical security cooperation. Right? When it comes to CSBMs, they were few and far in between. I could imagine, for example, Vietnam is the only country that bothers to define what militarization is for the South China Sea. If we are unable to focus more on the CSBMs, then I think we basically do not have the prerequisite for practical security cooperation. Therefore, so I will urge that maybe one way to look at it is to focus more on the CSBM's aspect when it comes to the Code of Conduct negotiation. And I want to respond to Yuan's point regarding the Task Force Philippines. I thought that point goes back to one of the earlier points I raised regarding sensitivities. No doubt, this is going to be regarded as a direct response to China. And what I tend to see, because the information about these new task force is pretty scant, I would imagine there will be a level of concern amongst ASEAN member states as to what exactly this task force is about and what are the mandates that the task force is supposed to accomplish. So one way to try to get around it, which goes back to our earlier discussions about AUKUS, is maybe for the Philippines and the US to try to share more about what exactly the task force is about across the region, to at least bring everyone on the same page when it comes to reassuring what this task force is about. Is it going to be a potential source of destabilization, or it could be a source of potential assurance? So I think this is one thing that I believe we are left to do. And to Captain Furuya's question, thank you so much for asking that. Now, more joint exercises and engagements amongst Coast Guards, I think this is something that has been floated around, and In fact, over the years since the signing of the CUES, back in 2014, there has been initiatives that were targeted at basically maritime law enforcement agencies. For example, we have the Coast Guard Forum, ASEAN Coast Guard Forum coming in and all that. But suffice it to say is there are still some structural difficulties. Coast Guards, after all, largely implement domestic laws. I think that is one key structural barrier when it comes to promoting closer cooperation, even, for example, agreeing on common mechanisms or SOPs. So when I listed it out there that we're supposed to promote more interoperability, it's often easier said than done. Easier for militaries, not so the case for Coast Guards. Maybe we can start small in that regard. So my final point, and that was to my friend Raman, you asked the most difficult question about what ASEAN member states will do, I will admit that I don't speak for all ASEAN member states, I speak as a Southeast Asian. In the case of a Taiwan contingency, and cognizant of the fact that, if there is going to be a Taiwan Strait contingency, the adjacent water spaces are not going to be left immune. In this case, the South China Sea, and by the extension, geographically, Southeast Asia. And I don't think we have here right now a collective ASEAN contingency plan when it comes to such a situation. And what I tend to believe is, and that's what the sensing I got, is that I think there is already some discussions ongoing, largely at the track 2 level. And there are, I believe, in the more recent times, some simulations being conducted, and I believe one is going to be conducted very soon again on that regard. And I think these simulations that I know about seem to draw out one important point, whereby there is still a sort of disconnect or dissonance among Southeast Asian countries when it comes to response under such situation. Some Southeast Asian countries tend to have greater stakes when it comes to a Taiwan contingency, given that they have, say, disproportionately more overseas expatriates, workers in Taiwan. So they will have very different stakes. And of course, when it comes to the assets required for, say, non-combatant evacuation operation, we have here an even more uneven picture. And that might require ASEAN to revisit some of its existing mechanisms like the AADMER, for example. I think this is probably going to be one important mechanism to be used in that regard. So just to respond briefly to your point. Thank you, Vina.
Thank you very much, Colin. I know we have brilliant panelists here, but very little time left. So if I could ask everyone to just kind of sum up and answer the most important questions. So maybe Ray, I'll come to you. Kind of just in 2 minutes, what are you taking away and what do you want to leave people with? I know there are others who want to ask questions in the room as well, but we are genuinely out of time. So I see your plaques, but I can't take any more questions. So Ray.
A lot of trees. I'm going to try to go back to the forest. China signed UNCLOS in 1996. It signed the Declaration on the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea in 2002. The DOC is a very simple document. It's only got 5 articles in it. China violates 3 of them repeatedly. One is it denies the freedom of navigation to ships operating legally within on the high seas within the South China Sea. 2 is it uses the threat and use of force. This is prohibited in the DOC, but it is what else do you call water cannoning and ramming and swarming? All of those are the use of force and the threat of the use of force, and it has failed to exercise restraint. Look, I made this analogy in Vietnam, I'll make it again. I live in Atherton, California, which is a place full of mansions. I have a very small 2-bedroom rental that apparently I can afford with all the CIA money I'm supposed to get. If one of my large neighbors in their mansions begins to move their wall and begins to encroach on my yard, and I can no longer get into large parts of my yard, and then they put large security guards there who push me around and beat me up whenever I try to go out to do my gardening, and then they say, well, why are you causing trouble? Why are you causing trouble trying to go to the place that you went to for generations in your family, and now suddenly you want to go there, but we've taken that now. And by the way, why did you let your wife take a video of it and put it on YouTube? Why are you provoking us? That's the situation of the Philippines today. China has appropriated things that did not used to have and is now blaming the Philippines for provoking it because it took pictures. And I'm sorry, but that is not an acceptable or responsible use of the power that China has. and that is the core of the problem.
Thank you very much. John?
Yeah, there's so much in there. I would say, I think the future of the region on this issue is continued tension. You did say that China will never compromise on sovereignty, but of course it has done historically when it's been weak, and even when it's not been weak, strategically with Russia on the land border. I think compromise there.
Central Asian states.
Central Asian states. So it is just a question of Chinese intent and strategic action and the placing. You know, someone else said, I think it was Dr. Hu said, China would never threaten the military use of the South China Sea. But I think that's what's largely provoking a European response. You know, remember, it costs a lot of money and resources that they can ill afford for European navies to have to come to the South China Sea and join this messaging. And then, you know, even though I'm deeply, deeply sympathetic to the Vietnamese and the Philippine positions and the sort of post-colonial context in which they're defending their sovereignty, I'm also partial to the sort of, you know, the perspective I get from, we heard in an earlier panel about the open seas, you know, with Russia doing what it's doing to the Arctic Passage, what China's doing to the South China Sea. You know, we're going back towards an age of mare clausum, where states basically rent-seek through controlling major trade routes. And I think it's up to a broader array of nations who will hopefully, collectively, peacefully, but firmly push against that new practice. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Freddie, final words?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for all of your questions. I took note of them, but I just would like to comment on what Dr. Hu said, and thank you for your clarification on the 9-dash line. You said that China's not claiming the waters inside the 9-dash line, just be the features inside the 9-dash line. So thank you for that. But our problem is, if you look at the radio challenges of the China Coast Guard, the language of the radio challenge, let's say they are patrolling within, let's say, 60 nautical miles from the archipelagic baselines of the Philippines, they would say that the waters are under the sovereignty of China. So that is a problem. It's not consistent with, but thank you, we took note of that Dr. Hu said that they're not claiming the waters inside. It's more like a claim on the features inside the 9-9. And with respect to freedom of navigation, you have I took note that China has an issue on freedom of navigation along disputed features. There are several features in the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines, and I said this in the South China Sea International Conference in Vietnam also just earlier this week, that the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines is a special one. It's not like there's no exclusive economic zone in the world like the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines, because it is the location of more than 100 features that are the subject of sovereignty claims of foreign states. So you can just imagine that the EEZ of the Philippines is dotted by these maritime features that are being claimed by several states. And so the arbitral award explained that not all of these maritime features are actually can be the subject of sovereignty claims, because some of these features or several of these features are actually low tide elevations. And so therefore, the waters of these low tide elevations, if they're within 200 nautical miles of the Philippine archipelagic baselines, the waters form part of the EEZ of the Philippines, and the submerged land area forms part of the continental shelf of the Philippines. So let's take, for example, Mischief Reef. Mischief Reef is just 125 nautical miles from the archipelagic baselines of the Philippines. It's a low tide elevation. And so therefore, the waters of Mischief Reef form part of the EEZ of the Philippines, and the submerged land area of Mischief Reef forms part of the continental shelf of the Philippines. And so therefore, the waters surrounding the Mischief Reef, since it's the EEZ waters of the Philippines, freedom of navigation applies to those waters. The thing about Mischief Reef is that there's an artificial island there now, about 550 hectares in size, but low tide elevations under international law cannot be the subject of sovereignty claims. So all of the low tide elevations within the EEZ of the Philippines form part of the EEZ of the Philippines, right? So thank you for that. And I would just like to connect this to the question about how can we see each other eye to eye. All of this can be resolved if we trust international law and the institutions that international law have created. If we have sovereignty issues, why don't we trust an international judicial body to resolve our sovereignty disputes? Why don't we trust it? With respect to the maritime dispute, it has been resolved already by an arbitral tribunal that was constituted under UNCLOS, to which both China and the Philippines are state parties. No more maritime dispute. That entire area is the EEZ of the Philippines, subject to the territorial sea of these small features. So I hope China can consider. I took note, of course, of what Dr. Sophie said about let's just agree on what we can agree on, right? But let's also have trust in the institutions of international law to resolve our disputes. And I end with that. Thank you so much.
I think that is a fantastic final word to end on, to trust international law and international institutions. I know there's a lot more that folks want to say, and I'm not going to try to summarize the last 90 minutes, but I hope you would agree with me that the conversation that we've had, the richness of the discussion shows why these kinds of conferences matter, why it's important to have different perspectives in the room and to hear each other both on issues that we disagree as well as the things that we want to agree on. Sophie, one second.
Wait, yeah.
Go ahead.
Sorry. Just very final words. I noticed there was a really great conclusion, and I noticed the Taiwan contingency came up a lot. But I think the message, if you read the news from Chinese media, state media, is very clear. The reunification will happen in the next years or so. That's written in the next 5-year plan of China. And also, Taiwan is not eligible to join the COC negotiations, but China is, because Taiwan is a province of China, and Chinese government in Beijing sends out a very clear message to the world that we welcome the world to recognize Taiwan as part of China,
okay.
and that has been the fact for a long time.
Sophie, I don't think we need to.
Yeah,
that's whole
that's
other
it
panel.
for now. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you. I think that will open up a whole other 90-minute conversation, which we really cannot be having at this point. I think we have enough issues that we agree and disagree on the table. So again, I'm not going to summarize the panel, but I want to thank everyone in the room for your fantastic questions. I want you to join me in thanking the panel for their fantastic contributions. And apologies for being a couple of minutes late, but I do recognize that there is also what our program says, heavy networking or heavy cocktails. So hopefully we can resolve some of these issues during the heavy cocktails. Thank you very much, and this concludes the session.
Thank you very much to our panelists. Once again, let's give them a big, big round of applause.